Antonov AN-225 Mriya, the largest plane in the world, 1988 to present day. On the 24th of February 2022, the Russian President Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine. Nearly all of the Western powers and its many allies saw this as an unprovoked Russian invasion of a democratic and independent nation. Whereas Putin claimed Russia was aiming to liberate the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the east of Ukraine from a supposedly corrupt and dictatorial government in the capital Kyiv. Putin also demanded Ukraine's permanent exclusion from the West's military alliance, NATO, seeing the expansion of the alliance to its borders as a threat, while furthermore seriously questioning the legitimacy of Ukraine's autonomy from Russia. Russia has gained strong support for this action from both Belarus and Syria. On the first day of the conflict, Russian paratroopers attacked Hostomel Airfield, a former Soviet Union secret test facility, located only 20 kilometers or 12 miles from Kyiv. It was later captured to act as a landing pad for further reinforcements by air. During the intense fighting, an Antonov AN-225 Mriya cargo plane that was at the airfield undergoing routine maintenance was hit and almost completely destroyed. With the loss of this aircraft, a truly unique piece of aviation history was lost, as it was the only one of its kind ever built. It was originally conceived in 1983 to carry the impossible at the time, to bring the Soviet Union's Buran space shuttle and core parts of the Soviet Energia rocket carrier from Moscow to Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This was considered to be a cheaper alternative than to finance a freeway from Moscow to Baikonur. The US and the USSR had been locked in a space race to outperform the other ever since the first satellite Sputnik was launched on October 4, 1957. The Buran space shuttle therefore had been the rival to the US space shuttle. There were also plans for the Mriya's use as an airborne launch platform for space planes, such as the NPO Molniya's MAKS. All the Mriya would need to do was reach a height of 10 kilometers in the sky, and the aircraft on its back could use 90% less of its energy to reach space than from on the ground. In mid-1984, only after a year of planning, a basic design model for this aircraft was finalized by Soviet engineers. It was approved by chief designer Petro Balabuyev of the Antonov Design Bureau in Kyiv and was given the green light by the Soviet government in 1987. Its official name is Mriya, which means dream in Ukrainian, and is also named the AN-225 after Oleg Antonov, founder of the Antonov Design Bureau. NATO codenamed the plane as Cossack, but this name is seldom used when referring to the aircraft. The Mriya first flew on December 21, 1988, only a month after the Buran's inaugural debut. And on March 22, 1989, the Mriya broke 100 aviation records, smashing the previous maximum takeoff weight held by the Boeing 747-400 by 245,000 pounds, or 111 metric tons. In May, after conducting tests at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the plane would fly the 2,400 kilometers back to Kyiv in 4 hours, 27 minutes, despite weighing 1.2 million pounds, or 560 metric tons, while carrying the Buran. 2 months later, it would fly for 3.5 hours to be shown off at the 38th Paris Air Show. Flown into Le Bourget in Paris, spectators were stunned not only by its Goliath size, but also because it was allowed to fly in the rain, something the US Space Shuttle orbiter would have never been permitted. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, however, the Buran Space Shuttle project would need to be abandoned, as well as any dreams of a second completed AN-225, as funding for such ambitious projects dried up. The final flight with the Mriya and the Buran would occur on April 12, 1991, to mark the 30th anniversary of the first manned flight to space by Yuri Gagarin. In 1994, the Mriya, after 339 flights and 671 hours in the air, found itself too expensive to be maintained, and was consequently grounded and partially dismantled to upgrade its predecessor, the AN-124 Ruslan. The Mriya therefore never had the opportunity to fly any parts of the Energia rocket or to launch any eager space planes into the cosmos. But a few years later, a niche emerged in the commercial market for a heavy-lift aircraft to cater for supersized and ultra-heavy cargo. As a result, in September 1999, the Antonov Design Bureau's successor and the engine manufacturer Motor Sich invested in a commercialized version of the Mriya. In May 2001, the aircraft was restored into service and was operated by Antonov Airlines. Antonov Airlines is a Ukrainian international charter airline which specializes in oversized cargo. Everything about the Mriya was huge and impressive. It was over 275 feet or 84 meters long, with a wingspan of 290 feet or 88.4 meters. This is a wingspan over double the distance of the Wright brothers' first motorized flight. And towering over all other aircraft, at a height of 81 feet or 25 meters, it was as tall as a 6-story building. To control this monster of an aircraft, it took a crew of 6 people, a pilot, a co-pilot, 2 flight engineers, a navigator, and a radio operator. The Mriya's colossal airframe was powered by 6 enormous Progress D-18T turbofan engines, 2 more than the previous Ruslan model, each capable of producing 51,000 pounds, or 24,000 kilograms of thrust. The turbine inlet temperature of these engines was about 2,420 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,327 degrees Celsius, which was hot enough to melt normal steel. Therefore, special superheat-resistant alloys had to be used in the construction of the turbofans and certain parts of the engines. After undergoing modifications in 2001, it could carry an incredible 560,000 pounds, or 253 metric tons of cargo internally, along with being able to carry externally an additional up to 440,000 pounds, or 200 metric tons, of outsized cargo, up to 230 feet or 70 meters long. All this allowed for it to have a maximum takeoff weight of about 1.4 million pounds, or 640 metric tons. But this meant that it had to have an extremely heavy-duty landing gear system, consisting of 32 high-impact wheels and a reinforced lower fuselage in order to be able to survive the stresses of such a high-impact landing. Already in September 2001, it flew 4 battle tanks to reach the world record-breaking 560,000 pounds, or 253 metric tons of cargo at the 44th Paris Air Show. On August 11, 2009, lifting a 413,000-pound or 187 metric ton generator, the Mriya achieved a world record for the heaviest single piece of cargo at Frankfurt Hahn Airport. Despite having cost around $30,000 an hour to hire, it had proved popular with customers, as it had many unique features like having a large ramp entrance at both the front and the back and a split-tail configuration. It made it particularly well-suited for extra-long cargo. In its 33-year-long career as a freight carrier, it had shouldered numerous cargo that other aircraft could have never had any hope of carrying, like 2 entire green energy tram carriages from China to Turkey, or 2 giant wind turbine blades from China to Denmark. Its use in humanitarian aid included transporting bulldozers and tractors to Haiti after the devastating 2010 earthquake, lifting vehicles to Japan after the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, as well as shipping over 100 metric tons of medicine and personal protective equipment like masks from China to Germany, Poland, France, and America in 2020. And although it's clear that the aircraft was destroyed, just a week after its destruction, a major Ukraine arms manufacturer is demanding $3 billion from the Russian Federation in order to restore the Mriya and bring it back into service, a task it says will take 5 years. Given the aircraft's huge contribution to the world, there may still be hope left for the dream. World War II guns being used in Ukraine. Relics fighting in the modern war. One could say that war never ends. For some weapons, their uses also seem to never end. Firearms produced for World War II can still be seen in today's front lines, still on par with their modern counterparts. Some of these are century-old designs, constructed for completely different warfare and conditions, yet pulled from their racks and still serving their main purposes. It's not unique, however, only to contemporary battles, campaigns, and operations to utilize old equipment. World War I saw usage of designs 40 or 50 years old. As it was anachronistic to use single-shot bolt-action rifles in World War I, it was the same as using multi-turreted tanks of the interwar period in World War II. There were instances on the battlefield where soldiers with old, worn-out assault rifles like the MP-44 were next to rocket-propelled anti-tank launchers. After World War II ended, there was simply huge stocks of various weaponry remaining. Rifles, submachine guns, anti-tank launchers, pistols, grenades, mines, bombs, all the weapons that were massively produced had to be put to storage. They wouldn't need to wait long for reuse though. The Korean War broke out in 1950, a mere 5 years after the end of World War II, only to be fully utilized again on all sides, along with the more modern ones. Later wars were no exception. During the second half of the 20th century, many wars were fought with a similar mix of World War II weapons and contemporary designs. As the technology progressed, however, so did these outdated and worn-out weapons become less visible in the ranks. Proliferation of assault rifles like the AK-47 made submachine guns and old rifles be completely pushed aside and practically useless in comparison. However, it didn't mean that those weapons would completely die away. Stocks were and still are kept. The world's superpowers still keep their old weapon stocks, for the second-line troops and as a reserve. Thousands of rifles of all calibers and types are stored away, a legacy of the Cold War arms race. After the political turmoil of Euromaidan protests in February of 2014, a war broke out in Donbass. In the twist of events, the understaffed Ukrainian army launched a so-called anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine. Opposing them were the local militias supported overtly and covertly by the Russian Federation. Their initial equipment and weapons would range from helmets and baseball bats, but would be upgraded to include modern rifles, tanks, artillery rockets, and rocket launchers. One antique weapon would return to service on both sides early on, the late 19th century Mosin Nagant rifle, carried and used in Donbass by the pro-Russian separatist forces. This rifle was designed from 1882 to 1891, adopted in service in the Russian Empire, and saw service in many wars up to present day. It's a bolt-action, 5-shot internal magazine-fed rifle, chambering 7.62 by 54mm cartridges. Usually fed by a stripper clip, it has a good range and accuracy. It was made in many variants, including carbines and sniper rifles. It served well through World War I and World War II, used by all sides on the Eastern Front. It's a crude and durable weapon, capable of dealing an impressive amount of damage over long distances. It was this rifle that had served one of the most renowned World War II Soviet snipers, Vasily Zaitsev, a man credited with over 225 enemy kills. He was using a Mosin Nagant M1891 rifle, fitted with a PU scope. The Mosin Nagant was produced in over 37 million copies and served many armies. Even with the advancement of sniper rifles and other infantry weapons, this rifle is still a potent and dangerous adversary. Another interesting weapon, slightly younger than the Mosin Nagant, is the historic Maxim machine gun. The PM M1910 is a water-cooled medium machine gun, chambering the same 7.62 by 54mm cartridge, belt-fed. It has a rate of fire of some 600 rounds per minute, featuring a metal shield with a two-wheeled carriage. It was used extensively in both world wars. During its lifetime, it was modernized several times over, improving ease of use and performance in the field. It was common to see Soviet infantry advancing while being covered by Maxim gunfire. One of the modernizations saw a change to the water cooler cap, making it bigger to allow the option of adding snow as a quick coolant. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense took advantage of the tens of thousands of these machine guns in their storage. In 2016, they were officially adopted into the armed forces and saw use in the war in Donbass. With the Russian invasion in 2022, these machine guns were more visible, being distributed to the territorial defense of Ukraine as well. Even though the Maxim gun cannot compete with modern medium machine guns like the PKM, it's still deadly and potent, capable of providing steady and constant volleys of fire over large distances. The submachine guns were seeing their full potential during World War II. Close combat inside Stalingrad was one of the major showcases of how short weapons with a good rate of fire and large ammo count could make a difference over the cumbersome long rifles. There were entire Soviet units which, when crossing into Stalingrad, would change their rifles for submachine guns. That would increase their firepower drastically and give them a fighting edge in the battle where buildings were fought over several times in a day. The PPSH-41, the most produced submachine gun of World War II, is a magazine-fed stamped steel weapon designed to be simple, cheap, and effective. It saw extensive use in the Soviet Army and in some conflicts after World War II. It can be fed with a stick magazine of 35 rounds or a drum magazine, which has a capacity of 71 rounds. It uses 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridges. It was so effective and efficient that the captured firearms were enviously kept by the German soldiers. Due to the high rate of fire and large ammo capacity, it could produce fire suppressions and superiority in shorter ranges. The PPSH-41 would see extended service in the Korean and U.S.-Vietnam War. Other smaller conflicts would also see this weapon utilized. Many warehouses of the Eastern Bloc still have them, oiled and stored, should the situation arise. When the separatist militias in eastern Ukraine started to arm themselves, one could spot PPSH-41s among the soldiers. Either for propaganda purposes or for actual combat, this weapon still shines, 80 years after being introduced into the service. It's disputable how efficient this weapon can be nowadays. The previous common ranges for urban combat of only a couple dozen meters between troops in World War II have been largely replaced by a ranged combat of up to 300 meters in modern warfare. Assault rifles have mostly pushed out submachine guns, having stronger, more accurate, and deadly calibers. Additionally, assault rifles have so proliferated that it's now much easier to obtain one than an out-of-date submachine gun. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that World War II submachine guns are not needed anymore. On the contrary, the younger brother of the PPSH-41, another submachine gun created by Alexei Sodayev in 1943, also saw service in Donbass. This submachine gun, named the PPS, was designed to provide simple and effective personal defense weapons for gun and vehicle crews, reconnaissance and support units. It used the same 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridge as the PPSH-41 in a 35-round detachable box magazine. This weapon was crude, easy to produce, and was produced in millions of copies. Its advantage over the PPSH-41 was its foldable stock, which made it easier to use in cramped compartments of vehicles as well as trench warfare. Although it didn't fully replace the PPSH-41, but rather complemented it, it would see service in the later wars and conflicts, just like its older brother, as it was more reliable, had a pistol grip, and generally it was easier to use. Overall, it was a practical, functional, and cost-effective weapon. Some separatist forces in eastern Ukraine manned the barricades in Donbass, although the actual use and efficiency is doubtful, given ranges at which combat is taking place and the general advantage of assault rifles and other modern weapons. Both of these weapons would use the aforementioned 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridge. This cartridge is rather easy to obtain, as even the popular and mass-produced Tula Tokarev 33 also uses it. This pistol is commonly known as the TT, or simply Tokarev. It was designed in 1930 by Fedor Tokarev as a service pistol to replace by that time the old Nagant M1895 revolver, but it turned out to be a supplement to the Nagant rather than its obvious successor. The Tokarev has an 8-round detachable magazine, simple and reliable mechanisms and design. It fires quite powerful cartridges, which in turn has a flat trajectory and increased penetration capabilities. The gun is renowned for its reliability and had served in many wars after its production ended in 1955. It's not surprising that it was one of the first guns to show up after the conflict broke out in Ukraine. Pistols were not that hard to obtain, and ammunition was readily available. Members on all sides are using it, making its war record continuing well into the 21st century. However, what has been mentioned have been more or less typical military firearms. Something extraordinary also showed up in this conflict: the World War II anti-tank rifles of the Soviet design. Anti-tank rifles were the product of the First World War, or to be more precise, as a countermeasure for the introduction of Allied tanks. They were big, cumbersome rifles designed to fire a large bullet and penetrate the armor of the tanks. Many European nations continued to build them into the interwar period. The Soviet Union had 2 rifles at their disposal. One of them, the PTRD-41, was hastily constructed in 1941 to fill in shortages and provide Soviet infantry with some sort of defense against the tanks. It was a single-shot rifle firing a 14.5 by 114mm cartridge. This cartridge was originally developed for the PTRD-41 and PTRS anti-tank rifles, but it's still being used up until this day in numerous roles. Back in 1941, it was more than capable of defeating the side armor of lighter German tanks, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks in the early stages of the German invasion. Moreover, it could potentially tear apart tank tracks and damage tank optics and other equipment. Used against enemy personnel, it was also very potent, as the rifle could deal significant damage to people, as well as soft-skinned vehicles and buildings. After the end of World War II, the rifles were phased out and used in limited amounts in several later conflicts. The introduction of RPG-2 and later anti-tank rocket launchers made this type of weapon obsolete. It was too big, too heavy, made too much noise, and other vehicles and weapons could fire the same cartridge in bigger and more accurate salvos. But its story didn't end there. In Donbass, there were instances, especially early in the war, where militia members would use this weapon against Ukrainian troops and equipment. This was despite the fact that the rifle itself is some 80 years old. It is capable of penetrating or seriously damaging armored personnel carriers and other lightly armored vehicles. Furthermore, the PTRD-41 was also used in sniping activities. With its large round, a whole 1 kilometer of range, and penetration capabilities, this weapon could annihilate enemy dugouts, bunkers, control posts, and entrenchments. As a matter of fact, some are equipped with the thermal scope, muzzle suppressor, and a rail mount, making it a formidable anti-material rifle. With such a long range and devastating power, it had proved to be a good weapon even by today's standards. On the other hand, one disadvantage that the rifle has is that it's a single-shot weapon. The next 1941 anti-tank rifle was the PTRS-41. While the PTRD-41 was developed by Vasily Dektyarov, the second one was made by Sergei Simonov. The main difference was that Simonov's rifle was a semi-automatic one, with a magazine capacity of 5 rounds. This rifle was used with the same pattern and same success as its PTRD-41 precursor. The prime targets were lightly armored vehicles and tanks, personnel, transport vehicles, and fortifications. However, during the Ukrainian war, this rifle had found yet another purpose, fighting against low-flying helicopters or drones. Some have even been pictured or filmed fired from the back of a supporting soldier, or even with the shooter standing up, shoulder firing. Even though the rifle itself is some 20 kilograms, the shooter was somehow capable of firing it from the shoulder. Another dreaded World War II weapon was the Dektyarov machine gun, or DP-27. This weapon would have used the same 7.62 by 54mm cartridge as the Maxim gun, but weighed less and was easier to move around. Almost 800,000 have been produced, and it served in numerous conflicts, both in the 20th and 21st centuries. The Dektyarov machine gun itself was quite reliable, which was not the case for its disc-shaped magazines. The gun would consequently be given nicknames such as the record player, due to the shape of the magazine resembling gramophone players. Called into the service of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, it was seen on the outskirts of Kyiv, among the territorial defense members manning checkpoints. After almost 100 years of service, it is striking that such a weapon can still find its use in modern conflicts. The crudeness and reliability of World War II designs made the weapons last incredibly long. Even though modern weapons surpass them in aspects such as quality, accuracy, rate of fire, ease of use, accessories, and others, they still find their way to the brutal front lines of war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 1917 to 1921. In the final years of the First World War, the Russian Empire was coming to its end. It had been devastated by revolution and finally transformed into the first communist country in the world. In the years following the revolution, non-Russian nations that lived under the House of Romanov sought to secure their long-lost independence. One of these was Ukraine. From 1917 until 1921, the Ukrainians struggled to build and secure an independent country, fighting against the new regime, against their neighbors in the West, and amongst themselves. When in February 1917, the revolution had overthrown the monarchy in Russia, and the event had echoed throughout the entire empire. In Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the Central Rada, or the Central Council, had taken over control of the country, which on June 23, 1917, proclaimed the Free Ukrainian National Republic without severing its connections with the Russian state. The nation began to awake. However, keeping the vast territory of Ukraine under control was a difficult task, and the country rapidly slid into anarchy. The collapse of the Russian forces in Galicia made matters even worse. On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, staged an armed insurrection in Petrograd, today known as St. Petersburg, and this became the uprising that changed the country for good. 3 days after this, together with the aid from Rada, the Bolsheviks attacked the army staff headquarters in Kyiv, forcing them to leave the city. However, contrary to Lenin's plans, control over Ukraine was quickly taken over by the Central Rada. The Bolsheviks were not popular in Ukraine, having no more than 5,000 party members in the country. Most of their supporters were industrial workers, Russians, and Jews from the Donetsk region. These men were antagonistic to the Ukrainian national movement. The Bolsheviks confronted Rada right from the start. On December 17, 1917, after failing to grab control over the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks left Kyiv for Kharkiv and proclaimed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Already at that point, the Bolshevik troops from Russia were preparing for the invasion of Ukraine. The war was about to start. The invasion army of 30,000 men entered Ukraine on December 25, 1917. Led by Vladimir Antonov Ovchinko, it comprised regulars of the Army of Soviet Russia and local Red Guards from eastern Ukraine. In response to the invasion, Central Rada proclaimed an independent Ukrainian state. Ukraine was defended by Free Cossack units, workers' battalions, the Hidemaka Battalion, comprising military school students, and the Galician Bukovinian Battalion of Sich Riflemen, which was made up of former Austrian prisoners of war. The strength of the Rada's forces was not more than 15,000 men. Ukrainian forces proved inadequate in stopping the invasion. One after another, towns in eastern Ukraine were falling into the hands of the Bolshevik troops. By the end of January, they had occupied Donbas and left Bank Ukraine and were approaching the city of Kyiv itself. The Central Rada sent a unit of around 500 volunteers to meet the invasion force, the student battalion of Sich Riflemen, and a detachment of the Hidemaka Battalion faced the enemy in the Battle of Kruty on January 29, 1918. Both sides had armored trains at the seam, but on different tracks. The Bolshevik troops quickly disembarked from their train carriages and started running towards the young Ukrainian soldiers, who jumped into a makeshift trench system and opened fire with their rifles and Maxim machine guns. The Bolshevik wave was driven back, but the inexperienced students thought that they were in a full-blown retreat, so they jumped out of their trenches and began to give chase. At this point, the next wave of Bolsheviks charged out from their train, and vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Plus, the artillery fire from both trains added to the carnage. The students were hopelessly outnumbered, and the few that were left alive were taken prisoner. They were shown no mercy, though, as a firing squad was quickly formed up, and about 18 of the young men were executed on the spot. That same day, the Bolsheviks staged an armed rebellion in Kyiv to overthrow the Central Rada. The fighting in the city lasted until February 4th, when government forces defeated the last group of insurgents. The failure of the uprising in Kyiv didn't withhold the advance of the Bolshevik army. The Central Rada was forced to evacuate Kyiv on February 8th. A day later, the Bolshevik troops entered the city and instigated their reign of terror. Facing total defeat, the Central Rada resorted to requesting foreign assistance. On the same day that the Bolsheviks entered Kyiv, on February 9, 1918, the Ukrainian National Republic signed the Brest-Litovsk Peace Treaty with the Central Powers. According to the articles of the treaty, Germany and Austro-Hungary had committed to providing military aid to the Ukrainians in fighting the Bolsheviks, in return for them delivering large quantities of foodstuff. In late February 1918, 450,000 German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers marched into Ukraine and swept away the Bolshevik forces. On March 1, 1918, the Central Rada returned to Kyiv. By the end of April, troops of the Central Powers had regained control of the entire Ukraine. The defeat of the Bolshevik troops in Ukraine coerced Lenin to sign the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and recognize the independence of the Ukrainian National Republic. On June 12, 1918, the governments in Moscow and Kyiv signed a preliminary peace. The peace with Russia brought no stability to Ukraine, though. The Germans overthrew the Central Rada and installed a Hetman government to secure a better foodstuff supply. Until November 1918 and the capitulation of the Central Powers, the Germans were controlling Ukraine. On December 14, 1918, they left Kyiv, and a new government came into power, the Directory of the Ukrainian National Republic. On January 22, 1919, the Ukrainian National Republic proclaimed the union with the Western Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian ethnic territory of the former Austria-Hungary. Formerly one country, the Ukrainian National Republic and the Western Ukrainian National Republic were actually two separate states with their own governments and armies. After the Germans withdrew, Ukraine fell into a state of complete anarchy. 6 different armies operated in the territory during 1919. The Army of the Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian Galician Army, Soviet Russia's Red Army, a Russian anti-communist coalition, the White Army, Polish troops, the Entente troops, and the anarchist units. Taking advantage of the chaotic situation in the country, Moscow launched a new offensive against Ukraine in December 1918. Kyiv responded with a declaration of war on the Russian Soviet Republic. The Ukrainians were entirely unprepared for the war, though. Their army of 25,000 men consisted of 2 main units, the Sich Riflemen and the Zaporozhian Corps, along with a number of partisan units under the command of politically unreliable otamans. Against them was the Expeditionary Force, composed of Red Army regular units and local irregulars. They too had around 25,000 men under arms, but their strength rose progressively with many partisan units joining their side. Under the command of Vladimir Antonov Ovchinko, the Red Army advanced on 3 fronts to eliminate the enemy and prevent the army of the Ukrainian National Republic forming up with the Galician Army and the Entente troops that had landed at Odessa while World War I was still in progress. The Red Army was victorious in the first months of the campaign, entering the city of Kyiv on February 5, 1919. After the loss of the capital, the head of the Directory was replaced with Simon Petliura, an experienced and prominent leader of the Ukrainian national movement. Under his leadership, the army of the UNR launched a counteroffensive in March 1919, pushing the Red Army units back almost to Kyiv. During the spring and summer of 1919, the Ukrainians and Russians fought vigorously in eastern Ukraine, while the Galician Army was fighting the invading Polish army in the west. 2 allied armies, the Army of the UNR and the Galician Army, joined forces in 1919, forming a combined Ukrainian force of nearly 85,000 regulars and 15,000 partisans. This mighty force was able to deal with the Red Army units and even entered Kyiv on August 31st. In the country's capital, the joint Ukrainian army confronted the Volunteer Army of the Whites, which led to the UNR declaring war on them. The autumn of 1919 was not good for the Ukrainians, though, as the situation was aggravated by an outbreak of typhus, which by October 1919 had decimated both the army of the UNR and the Galician Army. The 2 allied armies began to split on the question of their relationship with the White Movement. The Galicians signed a separate peace treaty with them on November 6, 1919, leaving the army of the UNR to fight against the Red Army, the Poles, and the White Movement by themselves. In the given circumstances, starting from December 4, 1919, the army of the UNR decided to abandon their regular military operations and switch to irregular warfare instead. During the first winter campaign from December 6, 1919 to May 6, 1920, the Ukrainian irregulars fought the Soviet 14th Army units over the entire territory of Ukraine. The irregulars marched for more than 2,500 kilometers during the campaign and fought in more than 50 battles. On April 22, 1920, the UNR government signed a Warsaw Treaty with the Poles, recognizing their claim to areas of western Ukraine in return for military assistance in the war against Soviet Russia. On April 25th, the Polish army, assisted by soldiers of the UNR army, launched an offensive on Kyiv. The city was liberated on May 7th, but only for a short time. The Red Army counteroffensive pushed the Poles and Ukrainians all the way back to Warsaw. In the ensuing months, the destiny of Ukraine depended on the outcome of the Polish-Soviet War. Finally, exhausted by the costs of war, the two sides signed the Peace of Riga Treaty on March 18, 1921. A border between the two countries was established, with western Ukraine going to Poland. The eastern part of the country became the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. The remnants of the UNR army continued to fight the Soviets. Their plan to launch an all-out attack against Soviet troops in Ukraine were interrupted by the Red Army offensive on November 10th. After 11 days of bitter fighting, the Ukrainians were pushed back into Polish-controlled Galicia. Over there, soldiers of the UNR army were disarmed and put into internment camps. The second winter campaign in November 1921 was the last attempt for the Ukrainians to continue their fight against the Soviets. 3 groups of volunteers from the interned soldiers were organized to enter Ukraine to inflict irregular warfare against the Soviets. They were poorly armed and equipped, but eager to fight, and morale was high. Their effort was futile, though. In the Battle of Malimanka, the Soviets crushed the last of the Ukrainian forces when the Bolshevik cavalry intercepted them, and 443 Ukrainian soldiers were captured, of which 359 of them were executed. The Second Winter Campaign was the last military operation conducted by the Ukrainian National Republic in their war against the Soviets that had lasted for more than 4 years. The Soviets ultimately won the war and formed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. On December 28, 1922, the Republic became one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
The history of Putin, 1952 to present. Born to a factory worker and a Soviet Navy conscript, Vladimir Putin's political exploration began early in life. From a young age, he enjoyed reading the works of known communists Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and his namesake, Vladimir Lenin. That foundation in politics carried on into college. At Leningrad State University, now St. Petersburg State University, he studied law. It was in college that he was first integrated into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a requirement of the time. He would remain in the party until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was at university that Putin also connected with someone who he would have ongoing relations with for quite some time, Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak would go on to co-author the Russian Constitution and contribute massively to Putin's rising career in politics. In 1975, just 23 years old, Putin hit the first major milestone of his life, joining the KGB. Throughout a 16-year career that kick-started his ongoing meteoric rise, Putin served in many capacities. He started in counterintelligence before being transferred to the monitoring of foreign dignitaries. After transferring to KGB headquarters in Moscow, Putin received his first mission going undercover. From 1985 to 1990, he was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, where he retained the cover of a translator. His time in Dresden was met with mixed results. Many intelligence experts, both now and then, assessed that the mass of press clippings he and his colleagues compiled amounted to absolutely nothing. Just another confusing chapter in the muddled history of the KGB. German intelligence officers and KGB colleagues alike downplayed Putin's activity, though it has since been claimed that this was done on purpose to cover for Putin's successes in support of the Red Army. Putin had integrated himself so well into East Germany, however, that he had to resign from the KGB in 1991 under suspicion of his loyalty, after which he returned to Leningrad, again linking up with Anatoly Sobchak, now mayor of the city, therefore beginning the second and shortest phase of his life, local politics. Here he served as an advisor to Sobchak, and various sources indicate that Putin may have worked as a taxi driver as well, to make a little extra money on the side. However, as always seems to be the case with Putin, a promotion was never far away, and he became the head of the Committee for External Relations. His role there was to promote international business ventures. That's when the first signs of corruption took root. A city investigation was launched into his dealings, and while the conclusion was that he should be fired, Sobchak retained the services of his longtime protege. A few years later, in 1994, Putin earned another promotion, this time becoming the first deputy chairman of the government of St. Petersburg, no longer Leningrad since the fall of the Soviet Union. While in this position, his political aspirations started to blossom. He organized the pro-government branch of the Our Home Russia political party. His power in the party continued to expand, and less than a year later, he was managing the entire legislative election campaign and rose to the head of the entire branch. When Sobchak, Putin's partner in politics, lost his mayoral election in St. Petersburg in 1996, Putin unhitched from the Sobchak wagon and planted himself at the heart of it all in Moscow, where he would begin the third stage of his life, leader. Another quick rise of power saw Putin appointed deputy chief of the presidential staff by President Boris Yeltsin in March of 1997. A year later, he rose yet again to first deputy chief. His return to intelligence began not long after, with President Yeltsin appointing Putin to the director of the reformed KGB, now the Federal Security Service, or FSB. But his return to intelligence didn't last long, because the Putin star was not one to stay stagnant. Another year into his rise to prominence, President Yeltsin announced that Putin was to be his successor. In tandem, Putin announced that he would be running for higher office, and within weeks, he became the fifth Russian prime minister in less than 18 months. Putin's political ideology emerged even more as he neared the top of the totem pole. An invasion of Dagestan by the Mujahideen and Russia's resolute stance in the face of the Second Chechen War gave rise to even more popularity among the ever-expanding Putin political base. With the people in support, the formerly independent Putin pledged himself to the Unity Party. Just before the turn of the 21st century, President Yeltsin resigned under dubious circumstances. Putin took his place, and as his first act as the president of Russia, he dropped all corruption charges that might have found their way to Yeltsin or his family. Despite this act, a series of criminal investigations circulated, some of which pegged Putin as a suspect, but all were dropped before they could take root. With all signs of corruption buried, Putin won his first presidential election with 53% of the vote in March of 2000. He used his first term to work towards the reconstruction of the impoverished, while simultaneously winning the complete support of the Russian oligarchs, former Soviet businessmen, rich off their spoils of their country, thus securing Putin's base of power. He suppressed all rebellions in Chechnya as it integrated back into Russia, and easily secured his second presidential term in 2004, earning 71% of the vote. Despite continued involvement in numerous bloody conflicts, conditions continued to improve in Russia, with life expectancy and GDP on the rise, as well as improvements to healthcare, housing, agriculture, and education. An independent media free of state influence was supposedly established as well, but in 2006, reporter Anna Politkovskaya was shot and killed on Putin's birthday. She had recently received international recognition for her exposure of supposed corruption in the Russian army. As Putin's power continued to grow, he prepared for what was to come at the end of his second term. Like the United States, the Russian Constitution prevented a third consecutive term, prompting the hatching of a plan to keep power. When Dmitry Medvedev won the 2008 election, he quickly appointed Putin as his prime minister, where he kept a watchful eye over the Russia he was building. Despite massive protests against fraud in the run-up to the 2012 election, Putin won quite easily yet again, rising to his third term. It didn't take long for former President Medvedev to admit that this was the plan all along to get Putin back into power. Putin's ongoing conflict with Ukraine raged in 2014 with a series of incursions while the Ukrainian political situation was in a state of disarray. Meanwhile, Putin passed referendums adding Crimea back to Russia as he slowly reassembled pieces of the dissolved Soviet Union. This invasion of Ukraine only slowed when Putin redeployed his troops in support of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, currently embroiled in a civil war. Putin's next attempted international intervention came during the 2016 U.S. presidential election, in which he ordered an influence campaign to denigrate Hillary Clinton. While Putin never overtly agreed that he had engaged in election interference, he did admit that it was theoretically possible he did, while also saying that if it wasn't Russia, it might have been Ukrainians, the Tatars, or Jews with Russian citizenship. In 2018 came Putin's fourth presidential election, with a record 76% of the vote. After once again attempting interference in the U.S. 2020 election, Putin's next venture was revamping his invasion of Ukraine in 2022, declaring it a special military operation to so-called denazify Ukraine. It was a movement that has led to persistent frustrations, with Russia unsuccessfully attempting to occupy its neighboring nation, while garnering a slew of global sanctions from the EU and the G7.
Soviet BTRs. In the late stages of World War II, the Soviets began to practice a doctrine of tank descente. This tactic emphasized the joint action of light infantry with tanks. Since the infantry had no means to follow the rapidly advancing armored troops, soldiers were carried into battle on top of tanks. They would get off the tanks only before the actual fighting took place. Lessons learned in the war helped the Soviets start their own Armored Personnel Carrier, or APC, development program after the war ended. German SDKFZ-251s and American M3 half-tracks were used as a reference for the creation of the first Soviet post-war APCs, the BTR-152 and BTR-40. However, in the mid-1950s, the requirement of modern warfare and the transformation of mechanized divisions into motor rifle divisions called for the creation of new transport vehicles. Thus, a new family of 8-wheeled armored personnel carriers were born, the BTRs. For more than 6 decades, 4 generations of BTRs and thousands of vehicles have been in service and are still roaming the battlefields. BTR-60. The first in the line of BTRs was the model BTR-60. Its design served as a model for all future generations of the vehicle. Later versions had features added or modified, but in essence it was the same type of vehicle. BTR-60 was built in the winter of 1956 under the requirements of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The Soviet Army leaders were looking for an amphibious 8-wheel, all-wheel drive vehicle with formidable cross-country ability, at least 2 turnable axles, and independent suspension. The task was given to several factories, one of them being the famous Gaz, which eventually won the contract. Even though Gaz's design was not the best, they beat their competitors through emphasis of simplicity and affordability. The Soviets needed new armored vehicles as soon as possible and didn't want to risk production halts. After it passed state trials, Gaz's design officially entered service as BTR-60. BTR-60 had a totally different design than all previous armored personnel carriers. It had 8 wheels and was built using welded, sloped armored plates. The driver and commander were positioned at the front, while the troop compartment was behind them. Unusually, the engine compartment was placed at the rear of the vehicle. Surprisingly, the first version of the vehicle, the BTR-60P, had a roofless troop compartment, an essential feature of modern APCs. However, starting from 1963 and the version BTR-60PA, vehicles received armored roofs. With a roof installed, the BTR provided far better protection but reduced the capacity from 16 to 14 men. The drawback of the vehicle was that it had no side doors. Instead, the crew and the troops had to use overhead hatches on the vehicle's roof to exit, which left the vehicle exposed to enemy fire from above. In 1965, the BTR-60PB was introduced, which strove to meet new wartime standards for APCs, with the addition of a machine gun turret on top of the roof. With the introduction of a turret, the crew was forced to accommodate a gunner position, which limited the number of soldiers in the compartment area to 8. The BTR-60 was powered by 2 90-horsepower, 67-kilowatt, 6-cylinder gas engines that allowed a maximum speed of 50 miles an hour, or about 80 kilometers an hour on the road. One engine powered the first and third axle, while the other powered the second and the fourth axle. This way, if one of the engines failed, the vehicle could continue running at a reduced speed. Being a fully amphibious vehicle, the BTR-60 could safely move troops across bodies of water. Before entering the water, a rear 2-wing lid opened to reveal a water jet, which could propel the vehicle up to 6.2 miles per hour, or about 10 kilometers an hour. A trim vane was also erected at the front to prevent water from flooding over the bow. The BTR-60 was produced from 1960 to 1976 and saw extensive use in countries such as Afghanistan, Cuba, Egypt, Iran, and Ukraine well into the 21st century. It showed several drawbacks, however, one being the armor thickness ranged from 5mm to 9mm, and as such provided good protection against assault rifles from any distance and machine guns at a more considerable distance. but it was ultimately unsatisfactory to withstand the impact of RPG rounds, which were becoming more common. The engine also suffered from a hot climate. The turret elevation of only 30 degrees was a problem because it didn't allow the gunner to engage the enemy attacking from higher ground. By the beginning of the 1980s, most BTR-60s were replaced with newer generation BTR-70s and BTR-80s. Those that remained were sent to border units and exported to third world countries. BTR-70. In 1971, GAZ engineers began developing the BTR-70, the next generation of armored transporters. To improve combat capabilities, the BTR-70 was designed to overcome the drawbacks of its predecessor. To begin, the internal seat arrangements were modified. A seating bench for 6 soldiers was positioned along the middle of the compartment. Soldiers inside sat back to back, each of them facing side fire ports. 2 more soldiers were sitting on single seats behind the crew with their fire ports facing forward, and the space between the second and third axles was increased to add a small exit hatch. The BTR-70 was also powered by 2 ZMZ 4905 115 horsepower or 85.76 kilowatt gasoline engines. Like its predecessor, the BTR-70 was widely used in Afghanistan, showing the same weaknesses. Most notably, though, this vehicle can still be seen on the battlefields in the war in Donbass and the Russian-Ukraine war. BTR-80. With the BTR-70 showing repeated poor performances in Afghanistan, the Soviets undertook a further evolution of the BTR vehicles, the BTR-80 in 1984. There were 4 main differences between it and the BTR-70, the first being the engine. Instead of twin gasoline engines, the new BTR-80 had a single 260 horsepower or 194 kilowatt turbo V8 diesel engine that called for a new arrangement at the rear of the vehicle. Additionally, because of the engine's position, the water jet box had to be removed. Instead, the BTR-80 had 2 external water jets fitted on the sides of the hull. The third difference was the improved turret. GAZ designers increased the elevation of the turret to 60 degrees. This way, the gunner was allowed to engage an enemy at higher ground and even provide anti-aircraft fire. The new turret also had 6 smoke grenade mortars installed at the rear. Finally, the BTR-80 had 2 side hatches installed to evacuate the soldiers at the troop compartment. The hatch consisted of 2 parts. The upper part was opening forward, providing protection from enemy fire, while the lower part was opening downward to form a ramp. Since 1984, more than 5,000 vehicles have been built. The model is still in the arsenal of the Russian Army and armed forces of former Soviet republics. In 2013, the Russian military industry started the production of a BTR-82A version, equipped with a more powerful 30mm 2A72 automatic gun that can fire armor-piercing tracer APT projectiles, high-explosive fragmentation incendiary HEFI, and high-explosive tracer HET ammunition. The new version was powered by a Kamaz 740 14300 turbo diesel engine, which generates 300 horsepower. For better ballistic protection, BTR-82A's armor was coated with Kevlar laminated synthetic materials. The Russian Army uses both versions in the current war against Ukraine, while the Ukrainian Army only has the earlier version in its armament. BTR-90. The fourth and the last generation of BTRs, the BTR-90, was first introduced in 1994. With a significantly larger hull, this version could accommodate 10 soldiers in the compartment area, 2 more than previous versions. The inner layout is the same as in prior models, with the new turbocharged, liquid-cooled, multi-fuel diesel engine positioned at the rear. BTR-90 has a whole new turret taken from the BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. The turret is armed with a 30mm Shupanov 2A42 gun, a 7.62mm PKT machine gun, and a 9M113 Konkurs anti-tank guided missile launcher. In addition, the turret can be adapted to use a more advanced 9M133 Kornet anti-tank guided missile launcher. Armored protection of the BTR-90 is also improved and can withstand shots from 14.5mm rounds. Furthermore, there is a possibility to increase the protection by adding explosive reactive armor panels. Currently, the BTR-90 is not in the service of the Russian armed forces, and the model is intended for export only, having been overshadowed by the BTR-82.
Army of the Ukrainian National Republic. Soviet-Ukrainian War, 1917 to 1921. In 1917, the Russian Empire was drawing to an end. Shaken by the political turmoil in the country and the burden of war, Russia was on its knees. At the same time, though, Ukraine, one of the largest provinces of the empire, was on the verge of fulfilling its long-lasting dream, independence. Throughout their history, Ukrainians had never been independent, as they had been ruled over by Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Austro-Hungary. When the First World War started, Ukraine was partitioned by the Russians and Austro-Hungarians, with a larger part belonging to the Russian Empire. In February 1917, the revolutionaries overthrew the Russian monarchy and created a vacuum of power in Russia. The Ukrainians grabbed this opportunity and formed the Central Council, Rada, to proclaim the Free Ukrainian National Republic within Russia. This council acted as the government of Ukraine and was tasked with forming the governing bodies in the country and establishing control over the whole of Ukraine. Their most important tool in achieving these goals was having control of the military. The process of creating the armed forces of the Ukrainian Republic was conducted by the General Military Committee. At the time, many Ukrainians were still on active duty, fighting in the trenches on the Eastern and Caucasus fronts. The committee began raising new units by forming detachments drawn from existing Russian army units that were located in Ukraine from before the war. After signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with the Central Powers, the army was reinforced with returning Ukrainian prisoners of war from German and Austrian camps. The main units of the UNR Army were the 1st Ukrainian Corps and the 2nd Zaporizhian Sich Corps, accompanied by several volunteer formations. The most experienced and skillful of these units was the Galician Bukovanian Battalion of Sich Riflemen, composed of Ukrainian POWs in service with the Austro-Hungarian Armed Forces. In January 1918, Ukrainian regular formations were disbanded, with the country's defense relying on volunteer units and local militia only. After a series of defeats in the Soviet-Ukrainian War against the Russian Bolsheviks in late 1917 and early 1918, Rada was forced to sign the Brest-Litovsk Peace Treaty with the Central Powers, allowing their troops to enter onto Ukraine's soil. The new government in Kyiv, the Hetmanate, tried to organize volunteers into a regular army of conscripts. As reinforcements, the Ukrainian prisoners of war from the German and Austrian camps, the Bluecoats and Greycoats, were attached to the Army of Ukraine. By November 1918, this force had 60,000 men under arms, organized into 8 corps and 4.5 cavalry divisions. However, the Central Powers had to stand down the same month, so their troops withdrew from Ukraine. They were replaced by a new government called the Directorate. After 2 years of war with the Bolsheviks and a lot of internal political turmoil, the new government had at its disposal 40,000 regulars of the Sich Riflemen and Zaporizhian Corps with elements of the Greycoats and 100,000 guerrillas organized in a number of small units. However, in reality, the Ukrainian government could only count on its regular troops, as these partisan forces were unreliable and lacked discipline. The situation improved slightly in mid-1919 when an armistice was signed with Poland. The peace on the western borders allowed the Directorate to once again reorganize the army of the Ukrainian National Republic. 12 full-size divisions, each of 3 infantry regiments, were mobilized and organized into 5 groups: the Sich Rifles, the Zaporizhska, the Volynyan, Udovichenko's 3rd Iron Rifles, and Adamantia Tulnets Group. In 1919, they were joined in a fight by the Western Ukrainian People's Republic Army, a military force with their own distinctive identity that kept them different from the UNR Army. A series of defeats in the summer and autumn of 1919, combined with internal clashes with the Western Ukrainian troops, plus an outbreak of typhus, decimated the UNR Army. Because of this, the Directorate switched from regular military operations to irregular warfare. As a result, the UNR had no more than 6,000 soldiers during the first winter campaign. There was one last attempt to reorganize the army in May 1920 by forming 6 divisions, each having 3 brigades plus a cavalry regiment. As a result, the strength of the UNR army by the end of the year, when the Poles and Bolsheviks signed a truce, was 23,000 men, 8,000 horses, 675 machine guns, 74 artillery guns, 2 armored trains, and 3 aircraft. There wasn't much this army could do as, at the time, the Red Army dominated all of Ukraine. Throughout the 4 years of its existence, the Ukrainian National Republic had struggled to maintain a regular armed force. There was always a lack of resources to arm and equip the men in the army. A good indication of the state of the armed forces was that UNR soldiers even continued to wear the old Russian Tsarist uniforms because they had none of their own. This uniform was practically the same as when they served the Russian Emperor and consisted of a tunic, breeches, knee-high boots, and peaked cap. The color of the uniform was a khaki olive-green shade. Privates wore a particular type of shirt tunic, the so-called Zimnia Sturka. The tunic was based on a traditional Russian peasant shirt with a standing collar and a front fastening. Some versions had 2 breast pockets. The Zimnia Sturka was worn loosely over the breeches and was made in 2 different materials, cotton for the summer and wool for the winter. In cold weather, soldiers would also wear the greatcoat, the chenille, and a woolen cap. The uniform was worn with standard Russian brown leather webbing equipment. What distinguished them from the Russian uniforms were arm patches and shoulder straps in blue and yellow, Ukrainian national colors. On several occasions, Ukrainians tried to abolish the Zimnia Sturka and the Tsarist uniform, but because of the lack of resources, the old garment remained widely used until the end of the war. Cossack and volunteer units didn't wear the standard uniforms. Instead, they were dressed in traditional clothing, especially the Cossacks, who wanted to retain their distinctive appearance. The most recognizable uniform was that of the Bluecoats, who wore blue zupons, which were long robe-like coats, together with the blue baggy breeches, black Cossack boots, and gray and blue fur caps. The Greycoats had a shorter zupon, standard breeches with puttees, and peaked caps. In April 1919, a new uniform was introduced consisting of knee-high boots, khaki breeches, a tunic, and a peaked cap with a cloth chin strap. The tunic was completely different from the Zimnia Sturka. It was an English-style tunic with 4 patch pockets and a vertical band on both sides of the chest. On the left arm, a distinctive trident chevron was worn in different colors for each arm of service. The trident, the national symbol of Ukraine, was also introduced on the metal cap cockade on a blue disc with a gold outer edging. The leather belt, straps, and ammunition pouches remain the same, though. As part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, the Army of the UNR received substantial military aid from the Western Allies that, among other things, included uniforms. In 1920, many Ukrainian soldiers were issued with a variety of Polish, German, Italian, US, and British uniforms. During the period of the Hetmanate, and especially during the Polish-Soviet War, batches of German, British, and French weapons also appeared on the battlefields across Ukraine. However, most UNR soldiers were armed with the Russian M1891 Mosin Nagant rifle. This excellent weapon was a bolt-action, 5-shot, magazine-fed military rifle chambered for a 7.62 by 54 mm cartridge. It was precise, reliable, and above all, a durable weapon, especially in the harsh weather conditions of Eastern Europe. It was probably for this reason why Ukrainian soldiers stuck to the Mosin Nagants throughout the entire war. Other weapons used from the Tsarist period were the Nagant M1895 revolver and Maxim's machine gun model 1910. The Ukrainian military leaders struggled to establish a well-organized armed force for a long time. Most of the soldiers in the UNR were poorly trained and lacked discipline and motivation. The dedication and bravery of the Cossacks and volunteer units were the only things that kept the Ukrainian fighting spirit alive. The appointment of Simon Petlura as commander-in-chief of the army in early 1919 greatly improved the situation. An alliance with the Galician army helped the UNR win a number of significant victories against the Red Army. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian forces were overstretched and fighting on more than one front, and an outbreak of typhus also quickly spread, finally leading to the total collapse of the army. The last 2 campaigns fought by soldiers of the UNR were the First Winter Campaign from December 1919 until May 1920, and the Second Winter Campaign in November of 1921, in which they were forced to withdraw from Polish-governed Galicia, where its soldiers were disarmed and put into internment camps. This was the end of the Ukrainian National Republic's army.